It was a late night when 30-year-old Ethan, a black man, was driving home after a long shift. The road was quiet, and the only light came from the flickering streetlights lining the highway. As he drove, his peaceful drive was interrupted when a police car's flashing lights appeared in his rearview mirror. Ethan pulled over, wondering why he had been stopped. There was no obvious reason. He wasn't speeding, his lights were on, and his car was in good condition. But as soon as Officer Grant, a middle-aged cop with a reputation for being aggressive, approached his vehicle, the situation escalated quickly. Without offering any explanation, Officer Grant demanded Ethan's license and registration in a harsh, impatient tone. Ethan remained calm, trying to comply with the officer's request, but the officer's demeanor only became more hostile. Officer Grant's demands quickly turned into orders. He insisted that Ethan step out of the car and, without any clear justification, began to search the vehicle. Ethan, aware of his rights, asked the officer why he was being searched. There was no reasonable suspicion and no warrant had been issued, but Grant continued, ignoring Ethan's questions. Ethan stayed composed, understanding that resisting could escalate things further, but the violation of his rights was clear. As the officer opened Ethan's briefcase without a warrant or probable cause, it became apparent that this wasn't just an ordinary traffic stop. This was a blatant overreach of authority, one where an officer felt empowered to disregard legal boundaries in the name of control. Unjust authority and the violation of rights. The incident reflects a troubling pattern of over-policing in certain communities, where Black individuals are often targeted or treated with suspicion without any legitimate reason. Ethan's calmness throughout the encounter was a demonstration of self-restraint, knowing that asserting his rights in the moment could provoke even more severe consequences. The law may give him the right to question an illegal search, but it doesn't always guarantee that his rights will be respected in practice. The unsettling reality is that Ethan's experience is not unique. Countless individuals, particularly Black men, face discrimination and unlawful treatment from those in positions of authority. This unjust behavior not only undermines trust in law enforcement, but also raises larger questions about systemic bias and accountability in policing. In a world where every citizen should feel secure in their interactions with law enforcement, incidents like this reveal the ongoing struggles for equality and justice. Ethan, like many others, faced not only the violation of his rights, but the mental toll of being treated as suspicious simply because of his race. It's crucial to ask, how can we move forward in creating a system where every individual, regardless of race, is treated with dignity, respect, and fairness, particularly by those entrusted with upholding the law? How should the justice system address situations where officers overstep their bounds during routine traffic stops? What can be done to rebuild trust between law enforcement and communities that feel unfairly targeted? Um, Discovery of damning documents, unraveling a dark secret. As Officer Grant continued his illegal search of Ethan's vehicle, the tension mounted. Ethan watched in disbelief as Grant rummaged through his personal belongings, his actions growing more intrusive with each passing second. But nothing could have prepared either of them for what the officer would find inside the briefcase. Tucked between work documents was a file labeled confidential. Grant's expression shifted from arrogance to curiosity as he opened it. Inside were documents that appeared to contain sensitive information, detailed reports, names, and transactions that didn't seem connected to Ethan's everyday life. His brow furrowed as he skimmed the pages, realizing he had stumbled upon something far beyond the scope of a routine traffic stop. Ethan's calm exterior remained, but inside his mind raced. The documents were tied to his job as an investigative journalist, evidence he had been gathering for months about a corruption scandal involving local officials. Ironically, Grant's unlawful search had uncovered something far more incriminating than he could have anticipated, but not about Ethan. The power dynamic shifted. Grant's demeanor grew tense, as if realizing the gravity of his discovery. He glanced at Ethan, now fully aware that he had crossed a line, not just legally, but ethically. What was supposed to be an abuse of power had exposed a deeper, darker secret, one that might implicate people far above his rank. Ethan met the officer's gaze, a quiet defiance in his eyes. The illegal search had not just violated his rights, it had inadvertently pulled the thread on a conspiracy that could unravel lives, including, perhaps, Grant's own. At first, it seemed like just another random item, but as Grant sifted through the contents, his eyes fell on a series of documents. He pulled them out one by one, not realizing the significance of what he was uncovering. The first piece was a notice of termination, a document that had his name on it, detailing his own dismissal from the department due to numerous complaints and allegations of misconduct. Grant's face turned pale as he examined the papers further. Citizens' complaints filled the pages, detailing numerous allegations of abuse, racial profiling, and inappropriate behavior during traffic stops and arrests. His past was being laid bare, piece by piece, with each document more damning than the last. The officer's heart raced, and a sense of panic set in as he realized the full scope of his actions was now exposed. But it didn't stop there. Beneath the stack of papers, Grant found a small, innocuous USB drive. At first, he thought it was just another piece of technology, perhaps a personal file or a work-related document, but as he plugged it into his own device, the horror of what was contained within the files became clear. The USB drive contained videos and audio recordings of Grant's own misconduct. Some of the recordings were disturbing, conversations between Grant and fellow officers, where they mocked and belittled citizens they had targeted. There were even recordings of physical altercations, where Grant could be heard using excessive force on civilians, his actions driven by an underlying hatred and cruelty. The evidence on the drive was undeniable, and it painted a picture of a man who had used his position of power to exploit, abuse, and intimidate innocent individuals. The images, sounds, and documents served as irrefutable proof of his pattern of misconduct. For the first time, Grant realized that the very secrets he had tried to keep buried were now in plain sight. What began as a routine traffic stop had now transformed into a pivotal moment in the case of Officer Grant's corruption. The documents and the USB drive were game changers, revealing the depths of his abuse of power. Ethan, who had initially been the victim of an unlawful search, now held the key to exposing the truth about Grant's dark history. The discovery not only impacted Grant's career, but it also had far-reaching implications for the entire police force and the community it served. Could this be the beginning of the end for Grant's reign of terror, or would the system protect him, as it so often protects those in positions of authority? A reflection on justice and accountability. The discovery of these damning documents raises important questions about accountability within law enforcement. How many officers, like Grant, use their position to abuse power and tarnish the very trust they are sworn to uphold? How can systems be put in place to ensure that officers with histories of misconduct do not continue to harm the communities they are meant to serve? Ethan's discovery is not just about one officer's downfall. It's about the systemic issues that allow misconduct to thrive unchecked, often at the expense of those most vulnerable. How can we prevent similar incidents of corruption within law enforcement in the future? Confrontation and exposure, the moment of reckoning. As Officer Grant stood over the documents and the incriminating USB drive, his confidence began to waver. The evidence he had hoped to keep buried was now in plain sight, and it was clear that his world was about to collapse. Ethan, despite the overwhelming pressure of the situation, remained composed. He knew that this moment could change everything, not just for him, but for the countless others who had been victims of Grant's abuse. With a steady voice, Ethan calmly asserted, "No one is above the law, not even you." His words were a reminder that no matter how much power Grant wielded as a police officer, he was still accountable for his actions. Ethan's unwavering stance in the face of such aggression was a testament to his belief in justice, and in that moment, he knew that exposing Grant's misconduct was no longer optional, it was necessary. The journalist who knew too much. Just as the tension between Ethan and Grant reached its peak, the sound of an approaching car broke the silence. Sofia, a 35-year-old investigative journalist who had been working with Ethan for months, arrived at the scene. She had been tracking Grant's activities for some time, digging into his past and piecing together the puzzle of his misconduct. Sofia was not only a seasoned journalist, but also someone with the tenacity to uncover uncomfortable truths, no matter how powerful the people involved might be. When Sophia stepped out of the car, her gaze fell on the documents spread out on the ground and the USB drive in Grant's hand. She walked over to Ethan with a sense of purpose, fully aware of the impact this moment could have. Without hesitation, Sophia looked Grant directly in the eyes and said, "You've been caught. We've been tracking your every move, and now it's time to make everything public." Grant's once unshakable confidence began to crumble as Sophia's words sank in. He had always believed he could cover up his actions. His power had shielded him for so long. But now, faced with Ethan and Sophia's unwavering resolve, he realized that his ability to manipulate and control was slipping away. "We've got everything," Sophia continued, her voice calm but resolute. "The documents, the recordings, the witnesses. We have more than enough to expose you for who you really are." As the weight of the situation bore down on him, Grant's bravado evaporated. He was no longer the officer in control. Now he was the one on the defensive. The law, which he had so often twisted to his advantage, was now turning against him, and he had nowhere to hide. In that moment, Officer Grant realized that his career, his freedom, and his reputation were hanging by a thread. The fear that had once been directed at innocent civilians now turned on him. The people he had sought to dominate, Ethan and Sophia, had become his reckoning. The confrontation had forced him to face the consequences of his actions, and there was no escaping it. For Ethan and Sophia, this was not just about holding one man accountable. It was about taking down a system that allowed individuals like Grant to operate with impunity. With the evidence in their hands, they were prepared to take the next steps, exposing Grant's crimes to the public, ensuring that no one else would suffer from his abuses again. The confrontation between Ethan, Sophia, and Officer Grant marked a pivotal moment in their fight for justice. It was a reminder that the truth, no matter how deeply buried, would always find its way to the surface. And no matter how much power one person might hold, it could never erase the undeniable force of accountability. Ethan and Sophia were determined to see this through, knowing that their efforts would shine a light on the systemic issues that had allowed Grant's misconduct to thrive for so long. They were not just fighting for one person's justice, they were fighting for the countless others who had been silenced, ignored, and hurt by the very system that was supposed to protect them. What do you think should happen to Officer Grant now that the truth has been exposed? The moment of reckoning. After months of painstaking work, Sophia sat at her desk, her fingers hovering over the keyboard. She had all the evidence, the documents, the recordings, the dashcam footage that vividly captured Officer Grant's abuses and the testimonies from the victims he had terrorized. It was time to expose the truth. With a deep breath, Sophia hit publish, sending her story out into the world. The headline was bold: "Police officer exposed, a pattern of abuse, corruption, and misconduct uncovered." The accompanying article detailed Grant's history, including the damning evidence found in his briefcase and the recordings that revealed his unspeakable actions. But it was the dashcam footage that would truly shock the public, a clear, undeniable record of Grant's abusive behavior as he violently confronted and humiliated civilians without cause or justification. Within minutes, the story began to spread like wildfire. Social media erupted with reactions of disbelief, anger, and horror. People from all over the world watched the dashcam footage, some in shock, others in sorrow, as they realized how deep the corruption went. The hashtag justice for the victims trended, and the demands for accountability grew louder. Protests soon erupted in cities across the country, with citizens gathering in solidarity to demand justice, not just for Ethan, but for all the victims who had suffered under corrupt law enforcement. Signs reading, "Defund corruption, not communities," and "Police accountability now," filled the streets as thousands took to the streets, their voices united in a powerful call for reform. The power of social media had ensured that the public could no longer ignore the injustices that had been hidden for far too long. The outrage reached a fever pitch as more people began to share their own experiences of police misconduct and abuse. It became clear that Officer Grant was not an isolated incident, but part of a larger, systemic issue that had plagued the police force for years. The public's anger was palpable as citizens demanded that those responsible be held accountable. Sofia's report had ignited something that couldn't be extinguished, a movement for change. Protesters rallied in front of police stations, demanding investigations, transparency, and an overhaul of the way law enforcement calls for police reform and the re-examination of policing practices became the center of national conversation. The questions were no longer just about Officer Grant's actions. They were about the entire system that allowed him to continue his abuses unchecked. In response to the public outcry, authorities had no choice but to act. The police department, under mounting pressure from the community and government officials, launched an official investigation into Officer Grant's conduct. But this investigation wasn't just about one officer. It was about the entire department's practices and the culture that allowed misconduct to thrive. The internal review would scrutinize Grant's past interactions, as well as the behavior of other officers in the department. It would also address the systemic issues that had led to the cover-up of abuse and the failure to hold officers like Grant accountable for their actions. The investigation was a step in the right direction, but for many, it was just the beginning. The public revelation of Officer Grant's misconduct marked a significant turning point, not only for Ethan and Sofia, but for the entire community. It demonstrated that when the truth comes to light, it has the power to create change. No longer would the abuses of power go unchecked. The public's call for reform had been heard, and now there was momentum to create a safer, more equitable system for everyone. The story of Ethan, Sofia, and Officer Grant's exposure. The story of Ethan, Sofia, and Officer Grant's exposure was one of courage, perseverance, and the unrelenting fight for justice. It showed that even in the face of a corrupt system, the truth would always find its way to the surface. And when it did, it could spark a movement that demanded real, lasting change. How can individuals contribute to movements for justice and police reform in their own communities? Aftermath and continued fight, a new chapter in the battle for justice. The aftermath of the public revelation was swift and intense. Officer Grant, now fully exposed for his abuses, was immediately suspended from the force. The once confident cop who had terrorized so many found himself stripped of his badge and his authority. Eventually, Grant was fired, but his dismissal felt like just the first step in a much larger battle. For Ethan, the victory came with a heavy weight. While the system had acted in the short term, the real challenge was still ahead, making sure this moment wasn't forgotten, that it wouldn't be swept under the rug as so many had been before. Ethan knew all too well that retaliation was always a possibility, especially when standing up against a system as entrenched as law enforcement. He had already experienced the subtle forms of retaliation, being watched, followed, and harassed by anonymous sources. Despite the public outrage, he understood that for every success, there would be new battles. His commitment to seeking justice was stronger than ever, but the road ahead was uncertain. Would the system change, or would his actions make him a target of a new kind of oppression? Just as Ethan was grappling with the personal toll of his fight for justice, a surprising ally reached out. Derek, a former police officer in his early 40s, approached Ethan with an offer of help. Derek had worked in law enforcement for over a decade before becoming disillusioned with the corruption he witnessed within his own department. He had left the force years ago, but the haunting memories of the abuses he'd witnessed had never left him. Now, as an outsider, he saw an opportunity to make things right. Derek's experience in the department made him a valuable ally. He knew the inner workings of the force, the cover-ups, and the practices that allowed officers like Grant to operate unchecked. Derek had kept records, gathered testimonies, and collected evidence over the years, knowing that one day it might be needed to expose the truth. Now, with Ethan's help, he was ready to take action. The two men formed an unlikely partnership, one that would amplify Ethan's fight and turn it into something much larger than either could have imagined. Gathering more evidence, the fight for systemic change. Together, Ethan and Derek began to gather even more evidence of corruption within the department. They tracked down additional victims of abuse, spoke with current officers willing to testify, and uncovered internal documents that detailed more cover-ups. What they were uncovering was a web of corruption that extended far beyond Officer Grant. The system, they realized, was deeply flawed, and Grant's actions were only the tip of the iceberg. Each discovery fueled their determination. They were no longer just fighting for justice for one person. They were fighting for an entire community that had been systematically oppressed and exploited by those sworn to protect them. They weren't just exposing the wrongdoings of one officer. They were revealing a toxic culture within the police force that allowed corruption and misconduct to thrive. With every testimony, every document, and every piece of evidence, Ethan and Derek built an unbreakable case, not just against individuals, but against the very system that protected them. Their alliance symbolized the power of truth, resilience, and the belief that real change is possible, even in the face of overwhelming adversity. What started as a personal fight for justice had evolved into a broader movement for systemic change. With Derek's help, Ethan began working with advocacy groups, activists, and citizens who shared his vision of reform. Together, they raised their voices, demanding transparency, accountability, and a complete overhaul of the policing system. They knew it wasn't just about one department. It was about reforming the entire system that allowed abuses to persist unchecked for decades. The momentum was undeniable. People began to rally in support of Ethan's cause, joining the movement for change that had grown far beyond what any of them had imagined. With every new piece of evidence they uncovered, with every new person who came forward, they brought more attention to the need for radical reform. The fight for justice had become bigger than just Ethan. It had become a national movement for police accountability and systemic change. The continued fight, a journey, not an end. Even as Ethan and Derek's work gained traction, they both knew this was just the beginning. The path to meaningful change was long and fraught with obstacles. Retaliation, political opposition, and the power of entrenched interests would continue to stand in their way. But Ethan, who had started out as a lone voice demanding justice, now stood alongside others who shared his vision for a better, fairer society. The fight was no longer just about a single officer. It was about confronting the system that allowed corruption to flourish, about dismantling the power structures that prioritized cover-ups over accountability. Ethan's personal journey had led him to a broader purpose, one that would demand not only the removal of bad actors, but a complete restructuring of law enforcement practices to prioritize justice, fairness, and equality for all. Ethan had become more than just a whistleblower. He had become a symbol of the fight for systemic change. And together with Derek and the growing movement of supporters, he was ready to take on the battles that lay ahead. How can communities build lasting change and ensure that those responsible for police misconduct are held accountable for the long term? Impact and hope for the future, a new dawn of accountability. As the investigation unfolded, the truth became undeniable. Multiple officers, including high-ranking officials, were implicated in the same network of corruption that had enabled Officer Grant's misconduct. The evidence was irrefutable, and the public outcry reached a level that could no longer be ignored. For the first time in years, there was real accountability. The department had no choice but to confront its systemic issues, and as the dust began to settle, significant reforms were introduced. The investigation triggered the formation of a new oversight committee within the department, tasked with investigating future allegations of misconduct and ensuring that all officers were held to the highest standards of accountability. The department also began to implement new training programs focused on ethics, de-escalation, and community engagement. While these changes were just a start, they represented a crucial shift toward rebuilding trust between law enforcement and the community it was meant to serve. Ethan's moment, inspiring change and empowering the community. In the midst of these changes, Ethan stood at the center of a public rally, his voice now amplified, carrying the weight of his journey. The rally was a powerful display of solidarity as community members, activists, and supporters gathered to demand not just justice for Ethan, but for all those who had been hurt by a broken system. Standing before the crowd, Ethan spoke passionately about the power of ordinary people to affect change. "This movement wasn't just about me," he said, his voice unwavering. "It's about all of us. It's about the people who have been silenced, who have been oppressed, and who have been forgotten. Together, we have the power to dismantle the systems that perpetuate injustice. And together, we can rebuild a society where accountability is not optional. It's a guarantee." His words resonated deeply with the crowd, a reminder that one voice, one story can spark a movement that changes the world. Ethan's courage had not only exposed the corruption within the police department, but had ignited a fire in others, a fire that would not be easily extinguished. His story was a testament to the power of resilience, the power of truth, and the undeniable strength of community action. Hope for the future, continuing the fight for justice. Though significant progress had been made, Ethan knew that the road to true justice was still long and filled with challenges. The department's reforms were just the beginning. Retaliation from powerful interests, legal battles, and ongoing resistance from those who profited from the status quo remained obstacles to real change. But even as these challenges loomed, Ethan felt a renewed sense of hope. He was no longer fighting alone. He had the support of a community that was committed to creating a safer, more just world for everyone. The changes sparked by his courage had already begun to ripple outward, inspiring others to speak up, stand firm, and demand accountability. And with every small victory, Ethan felt more emboldened to continue the fight for justice, not just for himself, but for all those who had been wronged by a corrupt system. The future, though uncertain, now held the possibility of real change, and for Ethan, that possibility was enough to keep going. Ethan's story wasn't just about exposing one officer's wrongdoing. It was about dismantling the very structures that allowed corruption to thrive. It was a reminder that systemic change begins with individuals who refuse to accept the status quo, and that true progress is made when ordinary people rise up, speak out, and stand together. As Ethan continued his work alongside those who shared his vision, he knew that the fight for justice would not be quick or easy. But he also knew that the change they sought was possible, and every day he grew more confident that the future would be brighter for him, for the community, and for everyone who believed in the power of justice to prevail. What do you think is the most crucial reform needed within police departments to ensure lasting accountability? Thanks for watching and supporting Story Karam. Stay tuned for more powerful stories of change, justice, and resilience.